Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our International Speaker Series. My name is Angela Zhang. I'm the director of the Philip K.H. Wang Center for Chinese Law. Today, I'm very pleased to have Professor Taisu Zhang from Yale Law School to give us his latest, a talk on his latest book, Ideological Foundations of Qing Taxation, Belief Systems, Politics, and Institutions. Professor Zhang probably needs no further introduction, but I'll do it anyway. He is currently, in addition to his position at the Yale Law School, he also served as a global faculty member at Peking University Law School and holds a secondary appointment at the Yale History Department. Professor Zhang is author of two books. The first book is called The Laws and Economics of Confucianism, published in 2017 by the Cambridge University Press, which received multiple awards. And he's going to discuss his second book today, which I very much look forward to. Professor Zhang is a very prolific scholar, and in addition, a very popular commentator on social media on various Chinese law and governance issues. And I'm also very pleased to introduce my own colleague, Jack Cronkey, who will serve as a discussant for today's talk. Jack joined the faculty in 2018. He currently teaches property, equity, and trust. So he shares a lot of similar research interests as Professor Zhang. Jack's research has a very large research portfolios. His research centers on international legal history and comparative study of alternative labor and property institutions. So I also very much look forward to your comments on his book today. And don't be too tough on him. So he's visiting us for a week and a half. Okay, so without further ado, let me give the floor to Taisu.
Thank you. So thank you, Angela, for hosting me for both this talk and as far as I can tell for the entire visit. Thank you, Jed, for commentating. So I should just apologize up front. Like, I got COVID last week in Beijing because everyone at PKU had COVID last week. And I've recovered and I've tested negative twice at this point, but I'm still coughing a little bit. So if you see me coughing time to time during the talk, please don't be alarmed. It's just like a residue symptom of last week's unfortunate circumstances. So this is the, I don't know, like 17th time I've given this book talk. As Jed was as I was telling Jed, I'm pretty sick of it at this point. But thank you for bearing through it one more time with me. So this is the second book. As you can see, this is the cover of the book. This is the second book in a planned 3-book series. For me, the far more fun thing nowadays is actually writing the third book, which I think I currently have like a chapter and a half of. But this is, like middle books in trilogies are kind of like middle children. We tend to not treat them so carefully, I suppose. And so this book became a bit of a monstrosity. It's like 400, it's twice as long as the first book. It warped into this gigantic 700-page monstrosity in my Dropbox folder at some point, and then I had to cut it back down. But in the end, it came out in, I think, a relatively pretty good shape. And so let me just summarize in the next perhaps like 25 minutes the main arguments of the book for you guys. So the core driving concern of the book is to explain why the late Qing, why the late imperial Chinese state, in particular the Qing state, was super weak in fiscal terms. Now, when I say super weak in fiscal terms, I really mean unprecedentedly, almost like unthinkably weak. And you can appreciate this in kind of two different comparison sets. One is, you can look at like various kinds of horizontal comparison sets. You compare Qing China with its contemporaries across Eurasia. And there, so, if you look at perhaps the best measure for fiscal capacity of a state, which is annual fiscal income as a share of GDP, Eurasian states around 1900 or 1800 pretty much fall into three categories. At the top, you can kind of say there are island countries, England and Japan. These are small homogeneous countries that tend to have relatively high state capacity. And so they tend to tax something more than 15%. The second category is what you might call kind of like middle-sized land-based European countries, France, various versions of Spain, various versions of Germany, and so on and so forth. And these tend to tax more or less in the like 10% range. So a step down from Japan and England, but still relatively high compared to the others. Now, the third category is what you would call kind of like large Asiatic empire. So the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, various Persian states, and so on and so forth. And you could also throw most other Chinese dynasties into this category as well. These taxed pretty much around 5% of GDP every single year. And then way below all of that, like there's Japan and England, there's France, there's the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire, then there's like 5 feet of like manure, and then there's the Qing. The Qing tax pretty much like, if you count formal taxes, less than 1% of GDP every single year for pretty much the entire second half of its lifespan. And I don't know of a single other state anywhere in world history that taxed this low an amount. This is summarizing what I just talked about. And beyond that, right, you could say, like, is this just because like there's something weird about China? That's not quite true either, right? Like, every single other Chinese dynasty, the Ming, the Song, the Tang, all taxed substantially higher than the Qing did. Like the Song was actually a relatively super high tax state that taxed more than 10% every single year, whereas the Ming and Tang and the Han also were all at least comfortably above 5%, and perhaps even above 7% if they were fighting wars. So, like, regardless of how you draw the comparisons, like if you're comparing with Eurasian contemporaries, or if you're comparing it vertically with other Chinese dynasties, the Qing is an extreme outlier. Now, within that general outlier problem, there's a separate weirdness of the Qing system, which is, so every tax system has pretty much 2 components. One is, especially in early modern systems, pre-industrial systems, where most of the economy is agricultural, there's always 2 components, right? There's an agricultural tax, which you extract directly from various kinds of agricultural production. And then there is non-agricultural taxes of various kinds, commercial taxes, salt taxes, iron taxes, tariffs, and so on and so forth. Now, the thing about the Qing is that in a lot of ways, it behaved pretty much like everybody else did when it came to non-agricultural taxes. So, in terms of commercial taxes, or like iron taxes or salt taxes, it was not different from any other Chinese dynasty. It behaved more or less what you might call fiscally rationally in that dimension. And by this, what I mean is that, when demand went up, when the state was fighting a war, when it just needed more revenue, or if supply went up, like when the economy grew to a much larger size than it previously had, then usually the state would respond by extracting more from commerce or so on and so forth. So all of these things put side by side, all of them, like, they all behaved more or less like you would assume. Like if there's more excess surplus in the economy, then you tax a little bit more. If you have more demand, if you're about to go broke, then you tax a little bit more to keep yourselves fiscally afloat. And so in that sense, right, if you just look at non-agricultural taxes, you'd think that there's nothing surprising about Qing taxation at all. This behaves pretty much the same way that everybody else behaves. The real uniqueness of the Qing system is what it did with agricultural taxes. Now, agricultural taxes are the bulk of the taxes because, you're dealing with economies that at this point in time were 75% agricultural, right? So the Qing is, as far as I can tell, the only regime anywhere in Eurasian history that never tried to increase agricultural taxes. And by this, I don't mean the agricultural tax rate, I mean the absolute volume of agricultural taxes. Around 1680, it fixed agricultural taxes at around 30 million taels a year. And after that, it basically just left the entire thing alone, despite the fact that by the end of the Qing, it was dealing with an agrarian economy that was 4 times as large compared to what it was in 1680. So basically, like, you have 4 times the fiscal surplus that you can tax and extract, but you're not actually touching it. This seems to fly in the face of everything that we know about fiscal behavior. Like no state is that self-restraining. Like states usually want to maximize revenue. If they don't want to maximize revenue, it's because they're forced not to. But in this case, no one, as far as I can tell, we're going to press this argument later on, was really forcing the team to not do this. Instead, it was an act of self-restraint. And as you guys can easily imagine, states don't like to self-restrain. So the real question here is what's going on here. Also, this is continuing at this one. And the thing is, like you can kind of make the argument that maybe they didn't need to increase the agricultural tax or so on and so forth. But the thing is, the Qing state, starting from something around 1720, is in a state of perpetual fiscal crisis. It's constantly under pressure after 1720 to raise more, to find more revenue for itself, which sometimes it tries to do by increasing non-agricultural taxes. But when non-agricultural taxes are extracted from only 25% of your economy, there's an upper limit to what you can do with that set of taxes. So starting from 1720 onwards, it faces multiple rounds of fiscal crises. Even during the relatively peaceful years of like from the 1780s onwards until the Opium War, this is the only period in time where people were arguing that the Qing didn't actually fight major military campaigns. Even during this period, like they still underwent at least one major fiscal crisis around the time of the White Lotus Rebellion. This is around 1800. And after 1840, it's like nonstop fiscal crisis one after the other. So across this entire history, right, like this 200-year phase where they're facing down multiple rounds of fiscal crises, they just constantly resist the pressure to touch their agricultural tax. They just don't touch it. And this is especially acute after 1850. So after 1850, the Taiwan Rebellion explodes across the southern parts of the country. That basically throws the state into full-blown fiscal crisis mode. It can't pay for anything. It needs to pay for huge military campaigns. It doesn't have the money to do that. And instead, even during this time, when the infrastructure was already there for it to raise the agricultural tax if it really wanted to, the state just voluntarily chooses I can raise taxes for anything else. I can triple, quadruple my non-agricultural taxes. I can create an entirely new category of commercial taxes, and I can tax merchants to the point where they're constantly complaining. And as far as I can tell, my commercial economy is being taxed to the breaking point. I can do all those things, but I still will not touch my agricultural taxes. Like it's just off the table. And so, as you can imagine, when you're in this severe fiscal crisis, and you're just absolutely categorically refusing to touch 80% of your economy, then you're not really going to deal with it in any robust, sustainable way. And that's exactly what happened in the late Qing. They spiral down into this constant downward spiral of fiscal ineptitude. And by the end of the dynasty, they're pretty much entirely broke. And if you were counting the top 10 reasons for why the Qing collapsed eventually in 1911, their fiscal inability to sustain themselves probably would have to rank in the top 3. So the question then is, okay, what explains this bizarre behavior? Why would a state commit such an extreme amount of kind of fiscal self-restraint? So there are lots of explanations. This is a major phenomenon. This is one of the single biggest institutional phenomenons in modern Chinese history, and so naturally, it's drawing quite a few explanations. All of these explanations, I should probably hasten to add, are pretty much issued by various kinds of economists, law and econ people, institutional econ people, various kinds of economic historians, some at Oxford, a couple in the U.S., and so on and so forth. One of my friends at Harvard recently wrote a book about this. And all these explanations, you might call them kind of like economically rationalist explanations, right? They all proceed from the assumption that Qing policymakers were, for the most part, behaving in a kind of like a self-interestedly rational fashion. You can build kind of like a rationalist political economy model to explain their behavior, and this should pretty much cover the entire base. My arguments, the starting point of my arguments in this book is that, frankly, they're all wrong. This is my favorite argument to make. Everyone else is wrong. But it's not quite everyone else is wrong. I think more accurately speaking, it's everyone else is incomplete. And I don't, given that we're only talking for 30 minutes, I don't think I have time to actually summarize why exactly they're incomplete or why they're wrong. We can go into these things in greater detail, but so to just like summarize in 30 seconds, the current explanations pretty much fall into three categories, right? There's a demand side explanation, there's a supply side explanation, and then there's a certain kind of like political economy explanation. The first is basically the Qing didn't need to raise agricultural taxes. This is basically the form of the Qing is a relatively peaceful, unified empire compared to its European peers. And because it was fighting fewer wars, it didn't actually have to raise as much fiscal revenue. And so this explains, for example, why the Qing state taxed more lightly than, say, either the Russians or the Ottomans or so on and so forth. It didn't fight as many wars, it didn't need as many taxes. This is, I think, demonstrably wrong after 1840, when the Qing state was fighting as many wars as any state in the world. But frankly, it's not even true before 1780, when the Qing state was constantly fighting these gigantic military campaigns in Central Asia. So there's really only like a 60-year period across the entire dynasty where the Qing was not fighting major wars. And even during that 60-year period, it was fighting down major rebellions in the form of the White Lotus Rebellion. Second category is it didn't actually have the capacity to actually do this. If it had tried to raise taxes, it lacked the administrative know-how to actually do this. I think the basic counter argument to this is actually that's not true at all. Why is that? Why is that not true? Well, actually, in around 1707, in the last 5 years of the dynasty, when the dynasty was pretty much on the verge of already collapsing, and it was completely broke because of war indemnities suffered during the Sino-Japanese War and also the Boxer Rebellion. It finally, in an act of final desperation, gave into pressures and raised the agricultural tax for the first time in over 2 centuries. And the interesting thing is that even in this extraordinarily weakened state in 1907, it managed to actually successfully raise the agricultural tax. Right? It raised the tax by something like 40%, and wonder of wonders, the peasants didn't rebel, the taxes were successfully collected, and the lesson that every other regime learned afterwards, after the Qing collapsed, was that actually, geez, like we actually have more ability to tax the peasantry than we thought we did. So like after 1911, everyone learns the lesson we should actually raise more taxes on the peasantry. So by the 1930s, the agricultural tax is 4 times as high as it was in 1900, and by the 1950s, it's 10 times as high. So the thing is, the Qing state is vastly weaker in 1907 than it was at any point, almost any point before that, with perhaps the exception of like the thick of the Taiping Rebellion, like the first 2 years of the Taiping Rebellion. So, you know, if you can raise taxes successfully in 1907, there really can't be much of an argument that you couldn't do so in, I don't know, 1870, 1840, 1820, 1780, 1750, and so on and so forth. So there's like an inbuilt counterfactual within Qing history that kind of falsifies this claim. Now, the third explanation is the explanation that my friend at Harvard, this guy called Wang Yuhua, who's a political science professor, has recently made, which is that it's really against the self-interest of Qing elites to actually raise agricultural taxes because they also own a ton of land themselves, and they don't want to pay taxes themselves either. Now, the main problem with this explanation is, I think it's partially correct. There's obviously something to this. But the problem is, if that were the case, then it's very hard to explain why the state is constantly able to raise non-agricultural taxes, but not able to raise agricultural taxes. Because the simple fact of the matter is, by something like 1800, most of these elites had more financial interests in commerce than they had in land. Right? Like, you know, if their self-interest was the main thing that was driving this entire phenomenon, their self-interest would have argued much more strongly in favor of not raising non-agricultural taxes, and probably they had less incentive to combat agricultural taxes. Instead, it's the complete opposite, right? The Qing state raises like non-agricultural taxes really brutally and aggressively across the second half of its existence and never touches the agricultural tax. So, I'm sorry, the self-interest of elites can only take you so far. So in the end, the rationalist explanations don't really work. But like the Qing state seemed to have demand to raise agricultural taxes. It seemed to have the ability to do so. And it also seemed to have like the basic political economy will to actually do this. So if these rationalist economic explanations can't work, then what happens if we begin looking into the realm of non-rationalist explanations? And here, the most obvious one, and after this, I'm just going to summarize the argument for you guys. The most obvious one that's been thrown around a couple of times in previous literature is the idea that there's a generalized Confucian bias against taxing peasants, and there is a generalized Confucian bias against taxing peasants. It's one of the most deeply ingrained maxims in Confucian political ethics. The idea that taxing farmers and peasants is non-benevolent, it's morally troublesome. It's not something that you should take lightly. But of course, the fact is you can't use that to explain the uniqueness of the Qing compared to previous Chinese dynasties, right? Like every single other Chinese dynasty was also Confucian, and some of them were frankly much more morally Confucian than the Qing was, the Ming, the Song, and so on and so forth. And none of those dynasties have had any real problem with raising agricultural taxes when they actually had to. Like when push came to shove and they were going broke and they needed the money, not a single one of them failed to raise agricultural taxes super aggressively. Usually this happened around mid-dynasty. The Qing is the only dynasty, the only Confucian dynasty, that resolutely refuses to raise agricultural taxes. So the question really is, if there's this constant Confucian moral extortion against raising agricultural taxes, what changes from the Ming to Qing that all of a sudden makes that moral maximum that much more powerful in the political sense in the Qing? And here, I imagine some of you guys will immediately jump to the most obvious candidate for why the Qing was special, which is the Qing is Manchu. Right? The Qing is not ruled by the Han population; it's ruled by a bunch of Manchus. When I was giving this talk at Harvard a couple of months ago, everyone at Harvard at this point was just like leaping up in their seats and was like yelling at me. It's because the Qing was Manchu. Well, yeah, the Qing is Manchu, but there are all kinds of logical problems with the Manchu argument that I can go into detail later on. And I think the Manchu argument is just wrong, so we can discuss that later on. So now I'm just going to summarize my own argument for you guys in about 10 minutes, and then we can go into discussion. So my argument is the following, right? So in theoretically abstract terms, the argument boils down to this, which is that for an ideology, for any kind of moral maximum to really become politically weaponizable, for it to really become politically powerful, it's never enough to just have a moral message. So politically functional ideologies tend to have two components. They have a moral component, which basically tells you the values you want to uphold. It tells you what exactly you want to do. It tells you, what are the goals that you should be aiming for in life. And then there is what you might call kind of like a pragmatic, empirical, descriptive dimension to the ideology. To kind of give you guys a example, consider Marxism, for example. If you're a good Marxist, the moral side of the ideology is the side of the ideology that tells you oppression and exploitation of the masses is evil, it's backwards, and so on and so forth. Like revolution is just, socialist revolution is especially just, communist revolution is the most just, and so on and so forth. There are varying levels of justness and moral desirability in the Marxist philosophy. But as you can imagine, like that alone is not really enough to get Marxism off the ground as a politically powerful ideology. What it also needs is an explanation for why communist revolution is actually going to succeed and how it can actually succeed. But it needs that kind of like a roadmap to victory. And that's where the other side of Marxism comes in, like its theory of history, its theory of social movements, the part where your good Marxist theorists will tell you that it's inevitable that the Marxist revolution is going to win because that's the inevitable, like unavoidable pace of history. Like history goes naturally from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism, and that general trend of history cannot be resisted. But if you think about it, that's not a moral argument at all. It's a descriptive one. It's a predictive one. It's the same sense in which, like if I argue to you that liberal democracies are economically richer than communist ones, That's also not a moral argument at all. That's a descriptive one. But as you guys can see, every single major ideology has that descriptive predictive side of things. That's the side of things that gives people faith that what they're doing, what they're pursuing as a normative matter is actually going to work out for them, materially speaking, in the actual real world. Now, the argument that I want to push for the political ideology of Qing fiscal practice is that prior to the Qing, this idea that you shouldn't tax the peasantry in the Confucian ideology, in the Confucian worldview, really only had a moral dimension. It didn't have a clear empirical dimension. That empirical dimension was produced in the Ming-Qing transition as an outcome of the shock of the Ming collapse. And therefore, right, like if you look at the variety of arguments that fiscal conservatives were pushing in the late Ming or the mid-Ming against fiscal expansion, which the Ming did all the time, by the way, they were heavily moral, but not very clear in their empirical dimensions, right? Their arguments always were, like you, Taisu Zhang, or you, Gao Gong, if you try to push fiscal expansion, you're going to be behaving non-benevolently, like you're going to be violating filial piety, you're going to be doing something unworthy of a gentleman. And then they would say, okay, we also think that if you do this, the peasants are going to not stand for it at some point and they're going to rise up. But the thing is, they don't know exactly at what points are the peasants going to rise up, and they don't know what the consequences will be if the peasants do rise up, because by that point in time, it had been quite a few centuries since, in their minds, the last major peasant rebellion had actually threatened the foundations of a dynasty. And in fact, prior to the Ming collapse, one of the interesting things about peasant rebellions in Chinese history is not a single peasant rebellion actually manages to kill off a major dynasty. They weaken it, they get put down by warlords, and then a few decades later, the warlords take advantage of their newly exalted status to usurp the throne. That's what usually happens. Right? That's what happened during the Han. It's what happened during the Tang. The Ming, of course, you could say was actually killed off by peasant rebellions, but that's not the story that the Ming told themselves. The story the Ming told themselves was that the Ming rebellion against the Yuan was led by a coalition of gentry and peasants, and it was a Han versus Mongol uprising, not a peasant versus elite uprising. So, like if you're looking for historical kind of examples to show these immoral fiscal expansionists, what's going to happen if you raise taxes too highly, these are all pretty distant examples. They're also not very good examples because they don't kill off the dynasties. Like the force of the threat is not that powerful. So instead, like these guys have to rely on moral arguments, and the moral arguments are usually enough to put people like Taisu Zhang and Gao Gong on the back foot. They make them defensive and so on and so forth. But as you can easily imagine, when it comes to politics, I mean, you make a moral argument to a politician. Frankly, that's pretty much the same effect that I'm going to get if I make a purely moral argument to my 7-year-old or my 9-year-old that he shouldn't eat too much ice cream. Like he's going to ignore me in the end when he wants ice cream. And the same thing is true for politicians with taxes. When they really want taxes, if all you have is lambasting them with moral arguments, they're going to find some way to justify their fiscal expansion no matter what. So the claim is that the main thing that changed between Ming and Qing is the Ming-Qing transition all of a sudden produced this empirical dimension, right? And how did it produce it? Well, because the Ming is the only major Han Chinese dynasty in Chinese history to actually get killed off by a peasant rebellion. The peasants actually sack Beijing. They force the Chongzhen Emperor to commit suicide. And that, like the full extent of that psychological shock to the elite psyche from the end of the Ming to the beginning of the Qing simply cannot be overstated. Right? Like that to the elite was really like a completely Armageddon event. It just fundamentally changes the entire way they view their role vis-a-vis the peasantry and so on and so forth. Right? Because previously in the late Ming, you could still find all kinds of people arguing that government was a force for good, or like the state extracting and spending was a good thing for society. By the early Qing, everyone is on the defensive. Like everyone's like the state's overstepped its boundaries. like we previously thought that there was some kind of red line the peasants wouldn't tolerate. Well, like now we know for sure what that red line is, right? The late Ming stepped beyond that red line. And as a result, we absolutely cannot step beyond that red line if we don't want to suffer the same fate as them. Right. So between the Ming and the Qing, the argument goes from raising taxes is morally bad to, well, raising taxes is morally bad. We knew that before, but now we also know for sure that raising taxes beyond a certain point, beyond a certain line in the sand, is going to kill you. So as you can easily imagine, right, like between those two arguments, raising taxes is morally bad may give some people some hesitation on the margins. Raising taxes is going to kill you beyond a certain red line. That can actually stop fiscal politics completely in its tracks. And my argument is that that's actually what happened in the early Qing. Now, so one thing to add here is that this entire idea that the Ming was killed off because of high taxes, this was something that became kind of like unanimous amongst the Qing elite within like 5 years of the new dynasty. Like this includes everybody at court. Everybody was writing pretty much along the same lines, and it also included almost every single person, every single private essayist, every single private philosopher who was writing out there in the world. Like the Gu Yanwu, Huang Zongxi, and Mao Fuzhis of the world were writing exactly on the same page. As the various mandarins at court who were advising the new the new Manchu elites on how much they could actually tax the populace. Like the speed with which the entire Qing elite, the entire Han Chinese elite, seemed to coalesce around this one historical message is just shockingly fast, and it's shockingly uniform. So to me, this cannot be the product of just objective observations of human history. Why? Because frankly, the claim that the Ming collapsed because of low taxes is a very contestable one. It may not necessarily be wrong, but modern historians looking at exactly the same question have been arguing this question for the past 120 years, and they're all over the place. Right, 30% of them seem to believe that the Qing did collapse because of high taxes. 35% of them seem to believe that that the Ming collapsed because taxes were too low. And then the final 30-something% believe that taxes didn't have much of a role to play at all. So that's what you would probably get if you're looking at the history of Ming collapse from kind of a neutral point of view. There would be, agreement would be hard to come by. It would be slow to produce. You would never get this kind of rapid coalescing around a single consensus that you see in the early Qing. So for me, the entire production of that early Qing consensus that the Ming was killed off because of high taxes is itself an ideological process. It's basically a process of old moral maxims telling people that taxing is wrong and taxing is morally dubious. That produced, as far as I can tell, a certain kind of framing effect that in a moment of crisis, substantively framed the way that early Qing elites were able to look at Ming history and interpret it. So when everyone in the back of their heads knows that as good Confucians, they're supposed to be morally anxious about raising taxes, they might still do it anyway, but they're all morally anxious, right? If you're morally anxious and then something bad happens after you raise taxes, like you do in the late Ming, and you're in a moment of crisis where you're under enormous pressure to coalesce around some kind of usable lesson learned from the previous crisis so that we don't let it go to waste and we learn how to survive in this new world of ours. When you're under that kind of mental pressure, right, the instinctive move is always to interpret events in the way that most easily conform to your kind of moral priors. And that's what I think happened here. Everyone had a moral prior. There was something morally dubious about raising taxes. All of a sudden, a series of major catastrophic events happen that seem to lend a semi-plausible interpretation of history that reinforces that moral prior. And when you're under this kind of pressure, you give into that framing effect. You give into that cultural cognitive bias really easily. Okay. So final thing is, all right, so I'm just going to try to wrap this up. So the final thing is, so that's part of the story. The second part of the story is, okay, so there's this initial shock at the start of the dynasty. Well, the dynasty is 270 years. You wouldn't expect no matter how large the initial shock, right? Like it's harder to get larger than the Ming-Qing transition because the entire Ming system just collapsed into rubble before their eyes. Even that you wouldn't think can last like an entire dynasty. Right? You can't produce a cognitive impression and an ideological worldview that lasts an entire dynasty. It has to get reinforced in some way. And so this is the part where I begin to look at how this empirical worldview, this empirical belief that the peasantry had reached their upper limit of being willing to pay taxes by the late Ming, and you can't stack. There's a fiscal red line of something like 30 million taels of agricultural taxes, beyond which, if you step one step, the peasants are going to rise up and kill you. Well, how did that belief begin to sustain itself over time? Right by 1720, I think, from any ex post point of view or any external point of view, the belief is obviously wrong. It has no bearing with reality, certainly by 1800, and by 1850, it's just laughably wrong. So why do people still kind of act as if this belief were true, despite the fact that, as far as we can tell ex post, it was completely wrong? And this is the thing about Qing taxes, right? We know it's wrong because we have access to all kinds of local data that, frankly, the elites at the time didn't actually have access to. The peasants weren't going to voluntarily share their production records with the state. The peasants didn't actually want to pay higher taxes. So if they had more production capacity on the ground, they weren't going to voluntarily disclose it to the Qing state. They weren't going to run to the local county magistrate and say, like, actually, dear official, we have 50% or 100% more production capacity than we actually reported in our books like 75 years ago. And now that we're actually substantially richer than we were before, perhaps you should tax us more. Obviously, no peasant is actually going to do that, right? So if the Qing state wants information about the size of the rural economy, right, and that has to be the foundation for any possible discussion of increasing the agricultural tax. If you want to overturn the perception that the peasants can't bear more taxes, you have to survey the lands, right? The Qing state really only has one way of figuring out how much tax capacity there actually was in the rural economy, and that's by basically this instrument called land surveys. Every single dynasty, every single country, as far as I can tell, that has a large agrarian base, before it increases taxes, usually it does various kinds of land surveys. It tries to figure out how much production capacity there actually is on the ground, and it tries to adjust taxes on that basis. Every single dynasty prior to the Qing does all kinds of land surveys across their histories. The Ming did a series of land surveys in its final 150 years. The Song did surveys once every 10, 20 years, and so did the Tang, right? The Qing is the only dynasty in Chinese history to never do a land survey. It just never does one. There's no land surveying done at the national level at all across the entire dynasty. And starting from around 1700, the court in Beijing actually makes it a prosecutable crime to actually do land surveys at the provincial or local level. So the shocking thing is this entire massive dynasty is basically just flying blind as a matter of official records when it comes to the size of its rural economy. Now, you could say at this point, well, if they don't have official sources, then surely there are people somewhere in the localities where this official goes down to the localities and they look around, do some math in their heads, and realize that actually there's more land in this locality than there is on the books. But the thing is, you got to think about this, right? Like, how would that actually work? If you're that official, and you begin to suspect that there's actually more tax capacity in the localities than there is in the official books, are you going to go back to Beijing and then propose that, let's come down here and do a land survey because I saw something? The thing is, by the latter half of the dynasty, the state fear of peasant rebellion is so extreme that anyone who made that proposal, like even proposed a land survey, to say nothing of proposing a tax increase, would get automatically basically censored. They would get charged by the censors with more corruption and irresponsible rule, and usually within 2 weeks of that memorial being submitted, they would get demoted or even fired. So there's a very big mental burden you have to overcome if you want to argue for fiscal expansion at court. And if you don't have any kind of like authoritative official figure behind your back to actually make this kind of argument, almost no one's going to feel politically comfortable enough to actually press the argument. So the kind of generalizable lesson here is that high politics don't run on what you might call common sense perceptions of reality. There is no such thing. But high politics run on manufactured authoritative information. And when the state voluntarily shuts off its main way of producing authoritative, centralized survey information, the state basically is flying blind. When the state is flying blind, old empirical assumptions of how much production capacity there is in the overall economy actually tend to get locked in for really long periods of time. And this is constantly reflected in the Qing when they believe that, like they know the population is expanding pretty rapidly, but they think they only have as much agricultural production capacity as they did around 1860. Around 1680. They think that they have as much production capacity in 1900 as they do in 1680. And in reality, they have 3 times as much production capacity in 1900 as they do in 1680, but the official record books don't reflect that. So they, in their minds, are mired in the perhaps deepest Malthusian crisis in Chinese history. They think their population has tripled, but the overall production capacity has not tripled. So they think that the population is constantly on the margin of starving itself to death. And if that's the case, then absolutely you can't raise taxes whatsoever. So it's like this entire episode to me just really drives home the malleability of elite worldviews. Right? Elites don't form their worldviews of local conditions based on, like ethnography. They don't form it on the basis of some kind of sense of reality that hits them in the face. They form their sense of reality based on records, based on reports, based on reading stuff, based on, frankly, sitting in their offices in Beijing and reading reports that are given to them. Once you lock that entire information producing apparatus into complete stagnation in such a way that it never updates itself across the course of 3 centuries, then what's gonna happen is that official empirical estimates of reality that you get at the very highest levels of government in Beijing in 1800 or 1840 are going to be incredibly grossly mismatched with actual reality on the ground. Right? Reality, political reality is a manufactured thing. It's a manufactured thing that's pretty much monopolistically manufactured by the state. When the state decides not to manufacture that information, then elite perceptions of reality could completely out of whack. Now, the final question then is, well, why do the Qing elites decide never to do a land survey? Now, here's the interesting thing. They decide to never do a land survey for the exact same reason why they decide to never raise taxes. They think the peasants are going to kill them. Why do you think the peasants are going to kill them? Their logic is that the peasants know that we only do land surveys pretty much for one purpose, which is to raise taxes. But if we can't even send off the signal that we're going to raise them, if we can't risk sending any signal that we're going to raise agricultural taxes, then we can't even risk a land survey, because a land survey is as good as a signal that we're going to raise taxes somewhere down the road. And if we want to just completely credibly commit ourselves to never raising agricultural taxes, then we have to even take this extreme step of never even doing a land survey. Right? This is the only dynasty in Chinese history that goes to such lengths to comfort the peasantry. And it really goes to show that in the early Qing, state fear of peasant rebellion is really at an all-time high across pretty much all of imperial Chinese history. Right? So the final thing is, how did all this end? Right? The thing about empirical perceptions is that, if your entire ideology runs on fundamentally an empirical worldview, then once that empirical worldview has been falsified, the entire thing crumbles. Right? And that's exactly what happened after 1900. As I told you guys, in 1907, out of pure desperation, they decided to raise agricultural taxes for the first time in 2 centuries. Now, everyone's expecting disaster. Everyone's thinking that peasants are going to rise up and kill them. Wonder of wonders, that doesn't happen. Now, once that doesn't happen, the spell is broken. Like the minute that you raise the taxes and the peasants don't rebel, and the elites realize this, and everyone's like, oh my God, like we can do this, and the peasants are going to kill us. So why don't we try more of this? This emboldens elites to raise taxes even further. And again, like by 1930, taxes are 4 times as high as they were in 1900. By the early PRC, they were really 10 times as high. And that really marks the decisive paradigm shift towards a new kind of statism, towards this really super aggressive fiscal state that we now see in modern Chinese history. And to me, like that reaction against the late Qing paradigm, you go from like a super weak state to a super strong state over the course of a couple of decades, is pretty much the same, the mirror image of what happened from the Ming-Qing transition, right? The Ming-Qing transition, the elites learned the lesson of you can't tax the peasantry, otherwise they're going to kill you. So you go from a relatively large state to a super small state in the Qing. And then in the late Qing, you learn the reverse lesson, that you had been wrong all these years, and you actually have more fiscal capacity than you actually thought you had. Plus, like a lot of people are blaming the collapse of the Qing on its inability to actually produce a robust state apparatus. So the elites then learn the opposite lesson, right? The lesson they learned from Ming to Qing is that we got to shrink the state. The lesson they learned from Qing to Republic to PRC is, my God, everything that was wrong with the Qing was because the Qing stupidly talked itself into this like super small state. If we want to build a new nation, if we want to make China strong, we have to do all that on the basis of a strong state. And so they swing all the way into towards the opposite paradigm. And you have, frankly, at this point in time, probably the strongest state apparatus in human history. Right? So that's all I'm going to say. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the comments.
So thank you, Taisu, for this really interesting book talk. And at this point, I would like to remind the audience on Zoom to start to raise questions. So as we will have some time for Q&A, and also I welcome the audience here. And let me welcome my colleague, Jack, to give his feedback.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Taisu. And I think for the audience, my comments are going to focus on sort of abstracting this into considerations about comparative history and methodology that sort of strike me. And that's why I like the book, right? It's not comparative history in the sense that some people think about, but it's the type of history that you need to do to have a comparative conversation. So I think this divergence debate in which Taisu frames the book early on is something that sort of existed for our entire academic career, right? And he makes this particular intervention about talking about agricultural taxes and state capacity. And in doing so, he does some things that are regrettably old, right? He has to dispel the fact that the Qing was a despotic penal state. And for many of you, that may be sort of obvious, but in comparative discussions, that specter is still commonly raised, right? He has to dispel the idea that this is an example that's overdetermined by Confucianism as a single explanatory variable. But he does these things in new ways, right? By disaggregating the Qing state and particularly disaggregating taxation, right? And discussing that it wasn't that Confucianism wasn't relevant, right? But the fact that the Qing state appears to be Confucian in a particular way was not driven by a pure moralism, but was a pragmatic reality in many senses. So if you actually read through the book and how he frames this discussion, you sort of see that debate about divergence sort of as it sort of evolved in the last few decades. And he shows that as sort of a synthetic work, right? In a theoretical sense, that if you have a particular variable like agricultural taxes that you want to sort of argue for its explanatory power, you really have to walk it through a gambit of other sort of factors and events, right? You have to be able to explain the whole of the Qing as he does, and look at these external and internal conflicts, and even, as I think one of the more interesting parts, like climate change, right? And climatic changes. All these are things that happen over time that you have to trace this particular variable, and he does a job through that. So he sort of provides the type of case study that you need to do, right? Hundreds and hundreds of pages to enable good comparison. So we're no longer just talking about the UK and China, which is the early frame of the divergence debate, but then you have to, as he says, explain Japan, explain the Middle East. You have to explain a lot of other examples, and without this type of case study, you can't really do that. And I should say, as a historian, right, he still does also then walk through the actual archival work to show the debates that people had, how people really talked about this, right? You can sort of give sort of econometric explanations for things, but at some level, you have to show how people really sort of reflected upon these. So especially in the beginning of the book, Taisu provides his own sort of methodological reflection about how he's thought about this debate and how he looks at doing history. And this is one of the things that I really like. He mentions this idea of like rationality and rationalism and what does this mean in practice. And as someone who was originally trained as an anthropologist, right, this is very natural, right? In my own work on like missionaries and modernization theory and empiricism, right? You think about how individuals, even when they're producing documents, right, as part of a process of meaning making about how they sort of frame their universe. So the really interesting thing here is that he sort of shows that this is an iterative process, right? When you have a sort of an ideological system, and he looks at sort of the normative and empirical aspects of this, right? This is something that's born of human cognition and institutional development and their interaction over time, right? So he demonstrates this as a self-intensifying process. Right? There's sort of institutions and culture changes to adapt to ideological pre-commitments in a way that makes them difficult to empirically revise later. Right. So he talks about Shurshui, this idea that people were thought about themselves as realists, right? They thought about themselves as pragmatic, but they're still severely and increasingly restrained to engage in this particular issue. So a lack of surveys, right, leads to a lack of capacity to tax. A lack of capacity to tax leads to an atrophied state, right? And this again intensifies over time. So what you really see here, and this is to borrow some language from evolutionary biology, is this isn't just a gradual change, right? But this is a theory of sort of punctuated equilibrium. There needs to be a precipitating event that so radically challenges the pre-existing world or falsifies it, as he's saying, that people are willing to enable these preconceptions to be set down. And it's not a natural process of just sort of academic self-reflection. So I think, you know, in some sense, it does beg the question about what makes a crisis significant enough, right, to have the sort of punctuated event. He sort of mentions the late 20th century. And then, you know, I think the natural sort of most calamitous event that people think about that he discusses is the Taiping, right? I think in comparative terms, people often still underestimate, you know, sort of the effect and scope of the Taiping Rebellion. But he walks through, like, even after that, they raised commercial taxes. They had some economic recovery, right? He shows why this particular crisis wasn't yet enough of these things. I think the probably question in my mind, why sort of general Western imperialism, the opium wars, I mean, people discuss these, why would this enough to shock the Qing in a variety of different areas, but not enough to shock it here, right? Maybe it was too slow for Western ideas of property and agricultural science, et cetera, to come in. And I think we also have a lot of writings about even like late Qing sort of moralism and legislative debates, right, about marriage and et cetera. People have written about this for a while. So it seems like this type of moralism inhibits things in a wider range of areas than just agricultural taxation. Now, since this is a law faculty presentation, you have to ask law faculty type of questions, which is like, what are the contemporary implications of this, right? And so I think anytime you talk about ideology and empiricism and normative, people are going to jump up with their contemporary examples. I admit, when I read this, I think about the Laffer curve. I don't know if you know what the Laffer curve is. It's this idea that we're perpetually on this sort of declining edge where the more you raise taxes, the less revenue you get. Amazingly, everyone who cites the Laffer curve always thinks we're on the declining part of that curve. I think in contemporary elements, modernization theory, right? When I was growing up, right, modernization theory was like the iron law of Western sort of perceptions of large parts of the world. But then in the last 5 years, we've had one of these punctuated events where all of a sudden, everyone disclaims that they ever believed in this thing that they were sort of so adamant about 10 years ago. But I think this is the interesting thing, and maybe would be Taisu's rejoinder, is that we today live in a world where there's almost too much information, right? The problem is how to sort through information. I was trying to think through examples of like of something that might be parallel. The only thing I could think of was like Mexico, I think in Brazil and the US, some except people who like wouldn't test for COVID, right? Like we're just not going to look at this thing and pretend. I mean, and some states didn't have the capacity to do that, right? But it was slightly different, right? So, you know, we have a different situation now where it's sorting through all of this information, but still some of the same dynamics can exist. Why did people think about modernization theory as being so sort of unassailable when there was so much other information against it? So I think the only thing, given the time, as I would sort of be curious about Taisu's thoughts, since he's presented this so many times, is that the state capacity debate that he's intervening in is one of these debates, right? For the longest time, people thought about the American state as being this like weak state that just sort of let the sort of free markets run. You know, Bill Novak and other people came and tried to disprove that. You know, Milton Friedman wandered around Hong Kong and had all sorts of like hallucinations about what Hong Kong meant for state capacity debates. But the flip side, and this is the interesting sort of Confucian side, is that we now sort of have state capacity as a form of like Chinese nationalism, right? And so it's the opposite, is that the only thing that matters, right, is the ability to tax and to gain this this type of strength. And whether or not you think there's any sort of like what people's reactions have been, given that people have such strong priors in these different communities. I guess the last thing, and these are sort of these other questions, is there any sort of like Toynbee Spangler type of like takeaway about how this can be avoided, right? It seems like almost all sort of cyclical things about empires is that there's no way to stop them once they're on their way down. Full confession, I wrote an unpublished paper a long time ago called Twilight Empire, where I compared like the current American regime to like the late Qing, exactly on these terms, right? It's an empire that needs to make itself more cosmopolitan and more ideologically diverse and open. But of course, these are always pains that people say before empires collapse. I guess the last thing then, and maybe just as a preview, is that this is, I think, the least legal of the trilogy, right? The first book is about capital accumulation and property rights. This is about tax, but really you have a sort of the next part of the trilogy is much more about, I imagine, sort of the corporations, debt, asset partitioning, all these types of terms that economic historians like. But I think it ties in here, right? So if this sort of like you talk about capital accumulation in the past, we're more in the song, here's the Qing, lack of state capacity, where then does this other project fit in? We already know why the Great Divergence, didn't happen. Why are we going, what is the sort of the legal sort of end of the trilogy really have to tell us that sort of furthers the story in a systemic sense? All right.
Yeah, you can respond if you want.
So thank you, Jed. Incisive and very useful as always. Let me just address like one or two of these questions because we don't have that much time. So I think the biggest question you're asking is like, how large a crisis do you have to have before you get out of an ideological paradigm? Well, as far as I can tell, if you're just looking at this, the Ming-Qing examples, it's something larger than the Taiping and something smaller than the Ming collapse, right? So something that's, like the Taiping for all its devastation was not really full-blown regime change, whereas the Ming collapse was full-blown regime change. So something in between is probably sufficient. Now, the thing is, it also depends on the durability of the paradigm, right? So the thing about this particular paradigm is that this is, like of all the things that the Qing commit themselves to, politically and perhaps almost like semi-constitutionally, in the early Qing, this is perhaps the single most durable thing. Right? Like this is the single most durable institutional commitment that the entire dynasty seems to have across nearly 3 centuries. So perhaps like to overturn something of this depth, it takes an unusually large crisis to actually force things. So this is not going to sound very intelligent, but I think it's kind of largely true. Like, how large a crisis you need depends on basically how strong a paradigm you're actually talking about. So if you're talking about some lesser paradigms, so like various versions of gold standard, like gold standard economics prior to the Great Depression, then a depression on the level of what you have in the 1920s and 30s is probably enough to dislodge that and turn most people into various kinds of Keynesians, right? Alternatively, the 2008 financial crisis was, at least in the US, enough to at least temporarily weaken the hold of a certain kind of neoclassical monetary economics that had seemed to dominate like macroeconomics for the previous 25 years, right? So, but the thing is that of course is a much weaker, less deeply embedded ideological paradigm than this like never raise taxes thing that kept a hold of Qing fiscal politics for so long. So yeah, it depends. The only thing that I'm completely sure of is that none of these paradigms, once they actually establish themselves as mainstream paradigms, will ever be dislodged without a crisis. As you saw in the later parts of the book, my firmly held belief is I don't think it's in the nature of ideological politics for the ideology to become like self-correcting. Like ideology is tunnel vision on a path, and they follow that path all the way to the breaking point, and then they only get out of it once things actually break. So this goes to your third question: can this kind of thing be avoided? My strong belief is that not really. Either you don't have an ideological paradigm, you have a state of like argumentation and fragmentation, and then things are more fluid. But if you have a mainstream consensus, and that consensus gets like sufficiently deeply embedded enough into the minds of a body of elites, the only way you're going to get them out of that is by some catastrophe. And so on this front, like I'm a pretty good Kuhnian, right? This is pretty much the Kuhn version of like scientific revolutions, right? Something has to break. Something has to like ram full speed into the wall before even scientists are willing to get out of like the previous scientific paradigm. And the thing is, compared to scientific paradigms, political paradigms tend to be a hell of a lot more powerful in terms of like maintaining control over their members and constituents, right? So yeah, I don't think this kind of thing can be self-fixing. They're gonna, like, once you're in a paradigm, and I'm not necessarily sure the U.S. is actually in a paradigm right now, because like there's so much polarization and division in the U.S. these days that it's not clear to me that there, especially these days, there is like a single dominant paradigm. Liberalism perhaps is kind of like the dominant paradigm. And yeah, I don't think the US is ever gonna get out of liberalism, except for some kind of like massive catastrophe. Like you might say what happens starting in 2016 is kind of like the beginning of that major political catastrophe. We'll see. I suspect it's gonna take something even worse than that for the US to ever become non-liberal. I also kind of hope that it doesn't ever happen. But then I don't know, maybe that just means you're doomed to some kind of like stupid version of liberalism for the rest of our lives. And that would make Sam Moyn extremely sad if you were here, but it doesn't bother me quite as much. So the final thing is like, what are the contemporary implications of this? I think a couple of things. One is like the book is interested in introducing kind of like a general way to think about their ideological paradigms and how they shift. So as with the things that we just discussed. The second thing is it also tells you, right, like the current Chinese preference towards statism is not something that's like scientifically discovered. It's not something that was and you just discover that this is like the right paradigm for China. For me, this is just like the natural conclusion of another ideological paradigm shift that happened around 1911. Right, like from that point onwards, China was pretty much sent inexorably on a path towards statism, because everyone around that time, from Yang Xichao downwards, talked themselves into believing the main problem with the Qing was that that everyone like you only know your families, you don't know the nation, you don't know the state. The main thing that they thought they were missing was the state. And so everything that happened afterwards, all the self-fulfilling prophecies that everyone told themselves from 1911 to 1930 to 1949 to 1955 and so on and so forth, is that we need a state. Everything that goes wrong is because we don't have a strong enough state. And it hasn't hit the breaking point, I think, quite yet. And they're going to keep going on to this. Like this is the new ideological paradigm that China is in. Like the statism that you see in China right now is really not a rational state. This is the new ideological paradigm. Statism to China right now is what fiscal self-starvation was to the Qing. And I suspect eventually at some point it's going to have similar consequences.
Fantastic. We actually running out of time, but I want to leave some time for Q&A or one or two questions. Yes.
No one has any questions.
Would you like to introduce yourself? And
thank you for your excellent presentation. I'm a PhD student at U Hong Kong, and I'm Cheng. I want to ask a question. Is ideology a consensus between the central and local government, or is a facade that is a strategy of negotiation between the central and local government? I ask this question because I wonder to what extent is ideology a necessary factor in decision making, or is it a representation or justification of people's decisions in the government afterwards?
Great. So I think for me, the difference between ideologies and what you might call kind of like cultural conditions or cognitive leaps or something, or things like things of that nature is, so I don't believe human beings, especially when they're thinking politically, can ever be purely rational. Like everyone makes use of some kinds of leaps of faith at some point in their political reasoning. Now, the problem is that not all those leaps of faith are necessarily ideological, right? The defining characteristic of an ideology is first, like, successful ideologies have this merging between the empirical and the moral that I described. But the more important thing is that ideologies are systems. Unlike, say, cultural fields or cultural habitus or whatever, ideologies are relatively cleanly organized, elite-driven systems of ideas that then become like self-reinforce in a certain kind of way. So if you lack that systemic nature, then for me, you could be biased, you could be cultural, you could be cognitive in all kinds of ways, but you're not necessarily being ideological. So this is why ideologies are in some ways different from all the other things, because the systemic nature of ideologies gives them greater staying power in politics, right? Like their ideas reinforce, their ideas have a way to kind of cognitively reinforce when you look outside at the real world, and it helps you kind of constantly reinforce your moral interpretations of the world with your empirical interpretations of the world. So that self-sustaining nature of ideological beliefs is in a lot of ways much stronger once you have the system than in just kind of like a cultural field and don't have that systemic self-reinforcing nature of the ideas. So in that sense, where like an ideology for me is just a moral plus empirical worldview, usually of politics, that has enough systemic rigor in it to become kind of intellectually self-sustaining. That would weed out, I think, most kind of like less clear, less structured ways of thinking that tend to dominate human politics and leave you with pretty much like only a small subset of things that you could truly call ideological.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes. Michael, you go first, Michael.
Thank you, Taisu, for your fascinating presentation. Congratulations on the book, and thanks for coming to Hong Kong. Welcome. I'm Michael from this faculty. Quick questions. From your archival sources, have you noticed any dissenting view to this belief system, saying just means, maybe it wouldn't kill us, maybe we could raise a little bit of tax, especially after so many crises after Taiping or before and after the Sino-Japanese War?
Great. So I think, so this is the thing, right? Like you start to see dissent after the Taiping. So the Taiping doesn't immediately produce a rejection of the old paradigm, but it begins to loosen it in some ways. And especially what happened after the Taiping was the Taiping caused so much demographic movement that once people began to kind of go back into the lower Yangtze, for example, you had to restart your land survey because, like, clearly by this point, the old land survey books are complete bullshit. So the Qing state slowly, as a result of the Taiping, begins to start redoing like small-scale land surveys from like the 1880s onwards. And the thing is, once they start to do that, a lot of things begin to change, because once you do the land surveys, you discover that like, even with these perfunctory land surveys, we seem to have more land than we actually thought we did. Like there's actually more land arable out there in the countryside than there is on the books. So a lot of the really strong empirical assumptions of how much land there was in the empire, how much production capacity there was in the empire, that were super dominant in like the 1830s, begin to become a little bit less so by the 1890s. And by like 1895, we see Liang Qichao or Tan Sitong openly questioning whether our old estimates of how much land there is in the empire are actually correct. So the Taiping has come at this like long trickle down effect where it begins to come like erode some of the empirical foundations of the old paradigm, but it takes a couple of decades. Now, prior to that point, there really isn't a lot of dissent. There was a little bit of dissent in the early dynasty before the paradigm had fully become solidified. But once the solidification actually happened as a matter of politics, right, by 1770 or 1780, if you propose dissent to this paradigm, at court, you're really risking your entire career. Because this is the kind of thing that would usually get you like demoted and sent out into the corners of the empire in the least desirable jobs, right? So when the risks of doing so are so large, as you can easily imagine, like most people aren't willing to stick their necks out to just propose a tax hike and then get demoted. So for pretty much like almost like a century and a half, there's virtually no dissent. The only dissent you periodically see once every 10 years is, there's a truly desperate local official who's completely out of money to actually pay for some local project. And he proposes, can we like do a land survey to see if there's a bit of excess tax capacity in my jurisdiction? And usually without accepting, the guy gets punished and no one else dares do the same thing for another 10 years. So the system becomes really super self-reinforcing as a matter of politics during the mid-Qing, and it's not until the Taiping comes along and shatters everything that things begin to kind of finally get rolling again. So yeah.
Does it work? Yeah. Gassam Wazin, the history department. Thank you, Professor Zhang, for the great presentation. I was wondering whether you could talk a bit about how you weigh like general Qing hesitancy of building up a strong state and taxing people versus your specific argument about agriculture and the fear of the peasants sort of rising up. Because of course the flip side could have been to say, well, we can't raise agricultural taxes, land tax, so we just go and raise commercial taxes.
Yeah.
And of course the Qing does it during and after the Taiping and quite successfully.
Yeah.
So could you like talk about that, why that doesn't happen earlier?
Right. So the thing is, prior to that, they do raise the commercial tax, but the commercial tax kind of like keeps pace with the economy, right? So it starts out at a super low base in the early Qing when the commercial lines are all pretty much all broken. And then as you see the commercial economy get revived, the overall volume of like non-agricultural taxes goes from pretty much like almost zero in the first couple of years of the dynasty to something like, I don't know, 15 million taels by around 1820 and 30. So it does grow in a non-insubstantial fashion. It's just that the state wasn't in a deep enough crisis for them to push the envelope even further. Now, once they are in a crisis, they just don't hesitate even for like a second to raise commercial taxes super aggressively in the late Qing. So it really tells you, like, every time even in the early Qing, every time they fight a war, they go into Xinjiang or Tibet, where the major army, what do? They raise commercial taxes. So like if you track the ebb and fall of commercial taxes, the commercial taxes always go up when they're fighting like a major military campaign or so. And so like, for me, that general pattern of kind of like what you might call basically institutionally rational behavior, what Weber would recognize as like rational fiscal behavior, is not so different from like the early to mid Qing to the late Qing. It's just that the late Qing challenges were that much more severe.
We're really running out of time and I still have a lot of questions, but I'm not going to ask here. Just one quick question. What is going to be the next book? Are you writing the next book already?
Yes. So the next book, I don't have a title. The next book is going to be like the final explanation for the Great Divergence that all three of these books are building to. And the basic claim is that, so going to Jed's question also of like, what's the broader project here? The claim in the final book right now is the main problem with the Chinese economy, and also the main strength of the Chinese economy post 1911, when it began to catch up, was capital accumulation. So prior to 1910 or 1920, China was, I think, by a gigantic amount, the lowest capital accumulation economy in the entire world. It was the only, so to have capital accumulation, all you really need are one of two things. Either you have tons of inequality, or you have a strong state. So all the European economies had tons of inequality. The British had both tons of inequality and a strong state. The Japanese, like the Chinese, didn't have tons of inequality, but they had a pretty strong state. So all you need is one of those things. And so everyone else had at least one of those things, and so everyone else solved the capital accumulation problem. But until 1920 or so, the Chinese had neither of those things. The first book explains why they didn't have a lot of inequality. This book explains why they didn't have a strong state. And the third book then explains the consequences of that combination for things like capital markets and financial markets. And so the end conclusion is that there's really no way to get capital for all these institutional reasons in the kind of like late Qing Chinese economy. And so this also begins to help you understand what happened afterwards, right? The main problem the Chinese state actually managed to solve with considerable cost from the 1930s to the 1950s, 1960s was it actually solved the capital accumulation problem, right? Like the state on the back of really aggressive fiscal extraction and in the PRC, just like seizing of major commercial assets, they finally concentrate capital. Now, in the process, the PRC destroys the market. But even without a functional market in the 1950s and 60s, they still actually managed to industrialize the Chinese economy. Right. So then by the time the 1980s comes around, for the first time in Chinese history, or a reason like for the first time in what you might call kind of early modern Chinese history, you have a combination of both a market economy that's being reintroduced, and you have high levels of capital accumulation. And so then the miracle just takes off. Right. So from that point of view, for me, the only thing the Chinese economy was really lacking in the Qing was capital accumulation. And it lacked capital accumulation because of a combination of Confucian property rights, in my mind, and, well, Confucian fiscal institutions that this book explains. So in the end, you can all blame Confucianism. But on the other hand, Confucianism kept taxes low and kept inequality relatively low. So, you know, there's an interesting trade-off here. It's a kind of a more humane economy. But the lesson is that if you want to capitalize and industrialize in that like early modern transition phase, you can't actually be humane. You have to screw someone. You have to screw someone, either the little guy or the taxpayers. Otherwise, you're not going to have enough capital. So that's the argument in the third book, and I'm writing I'm writing that book right now.
Very much looking forward to hearing your next book talk. Let's give a round of applause to Professor Zhang and our wonderful colleague, Jack Ronke. Thank you. Thank you for coming, and hope to see you guys next time, okay?